Okay, so we are in what's known as the 3 weeks. 3 weeks because it's 3 weeks which begin on the 17th of Tammuz, which was Sunday, and it runs for 3 weeks until the 9th of Av, and they are our national mourning period, as we all know, in which we mourn the destruction of the temples, plural, in Jerusalem, first and second. Now, traditionally, and as is the practice till today, it's a period of mourning, as I just mentioned, and the mourning increases as we progress through this time, starting from the 17th of Tammuz, and then once we hit Rosh Chodesh Av, it increases. Once we hit the week preceding the 9th of Av, it increases, and the 9th of Av, it comes to its height. Now, the Rebbe offered I don't want to say a spin, but offered a positive angle in how we can focus our attention on the positive. Specifically, he encouraged that during this time, we learn about the temple. We're mourning the destruction of the temple, and therefore we ought to learn about the temple and in anticipation of the third temple. Moreover, the Rebbe argued that the study about the temple is in some ways, or even actually, part of the commandment to build the temple. There's a number of different ways of going about understanding exactly what that means, but one of them is that in order to build the temple, we have to know how it's built and what it is. So by learning about it, it's itself part of the process of building. But it seems Rebbe took this even further, that the studying of the temple, studying about the temple itself, is not just akin to and considered as if we built the temple, or even a preparation to the building of the temple, but it's a fulfillment of the very mitzvah to build a temple is the study of it. So they're encouraged that during these 3 weeks, we study about the temple. So here is a teaching about the temple. It includes both classic commentary, we'll have some Chassidus, and we'll have, it's put together by the Rebbe, really. The Rebbe put together these various different pieces of the puzzle, and I'm just kind of presenting them, gleaning from the Rebbe's teaching. So let's start from here. As you can see, the title of the Mishkan, or Mikdash, that is the temple or the tabernacle or the temporary temple in the desert, Ramban with an N versus Rambam with an M. Maimonadies versus Nachmanadies. They both have the same name. Rambam stands for Rabbi, the M stands for Moshe, and the B is Ben, son of, and then the question is what their father's name was. Rambam, with an M at the end, his father's name was Maimon, hence Maimonadies, so he is Rambam, Rabbeinu Moshe ben Maimon. Our teacher, Rabbi Moshe, son of Maimon. Ramban, with an N, his father was Nachman, hence Nachmanadies, and thus is Ramban, with an N. Okay, so Rambam and Ramban, they do overlap in their lifespan, and they often are seen as disputants, if you will, and they are generally categorized as Rambam, Maimonides, as the rationalist, cold rationality, analytics, and Ramban, Nachmanadies, more the spiritualist, Kabbalistically inclined, more esoteric in nature. So we're going to see that difference play out in the way they understand the mitzvah of building a Beit HaMikdash, the mitzvah to build a temple. So let's start with this question. The building of the temple includes multiple different parts. You have the temple itself, the actual structure, and then there are the various elements within the structure. You have the menorah, the lantern, you have the altar, 2 altars, the bigger one, the smaller one, you have the wash basin, you have the Ark and the Holy of Holies, and so on and so forth. So how do you classify these various different elements of the commandment to build the temple? So let me explain what this means. The Talmud tells us that we have 613 commandments. Now, if you're to read the Torah from the text, as you well know, it's not as if it labels them and says, here's mitzvah 1, here's mitzvah 2, and so on. So there are many scholars in the post-Talmudic era who have gone through the Torah and like labeled all those mitzvahs, getting to the number of 613. So because the Torah doesn't exactly label what exactly counts as 1 mitzvah, what exactly counts as 2, or more, classic example is the tefillin. There's tefillin on the arm and tefillin on the head. Is that one mitzvah to put on 2 pairs of tefillin, to put them both on? Or is it 2 mitzvahs, one on the head, one on the hand? So you have various different ways of how you can define each mitzvah. And this becomes a discussion, a heavy discussion around how exactly you label and classify the mitzvah of building the temple, considering that it has so many components. So we begin with Rambam's view, Maimonadies' view, and as you can see here, 1138 to 1204. Born in Spain and then died in Egypt. So I have almost all the text in English, so you can read it together. So the 20th mitzvah, counting from 1 all the way to 613, mitzvah number 20, says the Rambam, is that we are commanded to build a sanctuary to serve God. In it, we offer sacrifices, burn the eternal flame, offer our prayers, and congregate for the festivals each year, as will be explained. The source of the mitzvah is God's statement, which says, make a sanctuary for me. So the make a sanctuary for me is a reference to the building of the Mishkan, the temporary temple that traveled with the Jews in the desert. But it's that same mitzvah which extends to the temple as it stood in Jerusalem. So it's the mitzvah, build for me a sanctuary. The Sifri says, an earlier Jewish source, that Jewish people were commanded 3 mitzvahs upon entering Israel: appointing for themselves a king is mitzvah number 1, building themselves a sanctuary is mitzvah number 2, and number 3, wiping out the descendants of Amalek. So the wording 3 mitzvahs shows clearly that the building of the sanctuary is counted as a distinct mitzvah. Okay. Now, says the Rambam, we have already explained that this general term, sanctuary, includes many parts: the menorah, the table, the altar, etc. All are parts of the sanctuary. Everything together is called by the name sanctuary, even though the Torah gives a distinct command for each individual element. So in Rambam's view, there is one particular mitzvah to build a sanctuary, and this mitzvah is broken down into multiple parts, each part being another element of the one generalistic mitzvah, building a temple, including the menorah, the altar, the temple, all those other details. Even though the Torah says, make for me a menorah, God says, make for me an altar, God says, make for me an incense altar, and so on and so forth. Even though the language of the text seems like it's a command, don't see it as a distinct commandment, but rather you should see it as just a part of the one general commandment, build a sanctuary. So this is Rambam's view. However, Nachmanadies, Ramban, who lived 1149 to 1270. So you can see he was born a little later, but they overlap, right? The Rambam died in 1204, and Ramban, Nachmanadies, is born in 1194. So what was he, 10 years old when the Rambam died? So Ramban comes a little bit later. And therefore he's often, a lot of his writing is like a response to Rambam, including this, which is on the book of mitzvahs, in which the Rambam lists 613 commandments. The Ramban wrote a gloss. And in the gloss, he presents his alternative view to Rambam himself. So on the question of the mitzvah of building the temple, says Ramban. I don't have the translator in English, unfortunately, but I'll just recap what he says. He says like this: there is one mitzvah to build the temple. That's a commandment. But the command to build a menorah is not a part of the command to build a temple. Separate commandments. So where does the command to build, let's say, a menorah come from? He says as follows: we have a commandment to light the menorah in the temple. In order to fulfill that commandment, we must build a menorah. So it's true, the Ramban says, building a menorah, building an altar, building an incense altar, those are not individual mitzvahs, but they are not part of the mitzvah to build the altar, to build the temple. They are just a preparation to fulfill the mitzvah of serving God in the temple. So there's a mitzvah to light the menorah, and therefore it's preparation, build a menorah. There's a mitzvah to offer offerings in the temple. As preparation, you got to build an altar. There's a mitzvah to offer incense. As a preparation, build the incense altar, and so on and so forth, with the exception of one item in the temple. Ramban's view, the mitzvah to build the ark, that's an individual mitzvah, which means, therefore, let's get this very clear. In Rambam, Maimonadies' view, one mitzvah, build a temple, and that includes multiple parts. menorah, altar, altar 2, ark, all of it. They are all parts of one general huge mitzvah to build a temple. In Ramban's view, in Nachmanadies' view, there's really 3 mitzvahs going on here. One is to build a temple, mitzvah number 1. Mitzvah number 2 is to build an ark. That's an individual mitzvah. And then the other mitzvahs are the mitzvahs of serving God in the temple. The mitzvah to light the menorah, the mitzvah to bring offerings, the mitzvah to bring incense, and so on. And the building of those items are preparation in the fulfillment of that mitzvah. Hope that's clear. Let's just zero in on the most important part for the conversation going forward, is the question of, does the building of the temple stand as an individual mitzvah? Or does it incorporate within it the building of all the items in the temple? According to Rambam, Maimonadies, there's a mitzvah to build a temple, and that includes all the parts that would be built in it, the menorah and all the vessels, and they're all just part of the mitzvah to build a temple. Whereas in Ramban's view, the building of the temple is a standalone free mitzvah, even if nothing else was in it. Meaning, even if you didn't put a menorah, even if you didn't put an altar, you built that building, that in and of itself is a mitzvah. Now you have a separate mitzvah to light the menorah, and therefore you have to build a menorah. You have a separate mitzvah to bring offerings, and therefore you have to build an altar, and so on and so forth. So when you fulfill the commandment to build the temple, according to Rambam, you haven't fulfilled that unless you built all the items in it. Whereas Ramban says you did fulfill the mitzvah because you built the building. Now you have a separate issue. You got to build also the menorah. In order to light the menorah, you have to build the altar in order to bring offerings and so on. Okay, hope that was clear. If it's not, please interrupt me and I'll try to clarify.
Yeah, it's clear. I'm just, that means numbering 613, whereas the Rambam would have to be finding much less mitzvahs in addition to, whereas the Ramban, if he's only counting 3, so you have to make up for those somewhere else. So like it's not affecting one thing, it affects the whole count, so to speak.
That's correct. So that's right. Every single time you change the count of one mitzvah, you have to think of the count for the rest of the mitzvahs. So there are all kinds of areas in which there's like questions as to, does it count as a commandment or not? I'll give one example to fill in, but I can give you another one. For example, believing in God. Rambam writes that that's the first mitzvah. Mitzvah number 1 is to believe in God. Ramban writes that the belief in God is not a commandment. It is an axiom before commandments. Before commandments, you have to believe there's a commander, right? So there's another dispute. Is the belief in God a actual mitzvah, or is it a priori before mitzvahs? And there are many, many such examples in which there's this difference between Rambam and Ramban as to where you count, and each one of them will have to leave with 613. You're correct. And that's part of the challenge of doing these kind of counting of the mitzvahs.
And that in that sense, that they have to have 2 entirely different philosophies, because
that's correct.
In essence, they both have to equal the same, and they both come to the same, and they both have the same
Torah
final reading. It's just different ways of getting to that same point. So if you don't think that believing in God is a commandment, like in essence, I have to say, you think about it, fundamentally, shouldn't be a commandment. That's, if you're already commanding someone to believe in something, you're starting off on the wrong foot, so to speak. So I'm not even sure why would you think that was a commandment?
We're not going to go down that route right now, exactly. Okay. Between Rambam and Ramban on that question. I did actually another series you can find it on YouTube. I did a 3-part series on that question, exactly how you define the mitzvah of believing in God. But we're going to leave that for now. I'm just using it as an example that this dispute between Rambam and Ramban goes throughout all the count. So you have the Rambam's book of 613 commandments, and then you have the Ramban's gloss. So in the Ramban's gloss, he's constantly providing an alternative to Rambam's view. Each will have to conclude with 613 at the end. Yes. Okay, so that's question number 1 with regard to the temple. Is the temple, in Rambam's view, the mitzvah to build the temple includes all the parts. In Ramban's view, the mitzvah to build a building is a standalone mitzvah. Building the parts is a continuation of a different mitzvah, which is to serve God. Now comes another question with regard to the temple from Rambam and Ramban. And this dispute is the underpinnings of the previous dispute we just cited. So the question becomes, the Torah refers to the temple as the place where God resides, a location where God is. And the big question is, does God have a space? God is everywhere, right? So how do you say that there's a home, there's a place for God? What does that mean? I mean, seemingly, God is omnipresent. He's everywhere. So how do we define the temple as a place for God? And here again, we get into a dispute between Ramban and Rambam. So let's begin with Ramban's view, Nachmanadies. So I brought 3 different texts, but you don't have to read all of them. Just read at least this one here. This comes from the beginning of his commentary to the beginning of Parshas Truma, right? Parshas Truma, which is when the Torah begins to tell us about the commandment to build the temporary temple in the desert. And there Ramban comments. So now that God has told Israel face to face the 10 commandments and had further commanded them through Moses some of the precepts which are like principles to the individual commandments of the Torah, in the same way that our rabbis were accustomed to deal with strangers who come to be converted to the Jewish faith, right? The law is that the conversion process that we have today is modeled on what the Jews went through when they received the Torah. And what he's referring to here is that when a convert gets converted, they don't have to know every detail of every single mitzvah. They just have to know a general outline of the mitzvahs and the most basic of them. And the same thing is with us when we got the Torah. We didn't know every single detail of the Torah when God gave us the Torah. We knew a general outline and we said, yes, we're going to listen to you. And the same thing is true of a convert, that they learn a general outline of the commandments and what it means to live as a Jew. And they say, yes, we're going to follow. Even though as they grow as Jews, they'll obviously learn more, just like we are learning more just like any Jew is learning more as they go on in life. So he cites to that source, and then he goes on to say, I'm right over here. And after the Israelites accepted upon themselves to do all that he would command them through Moses, and he made a covenant with them concerning all this. From now on, they are his people, and he is their God. This is in accordance with the condition he made with them at the beginning. Now, therefore, if you will indeed hearken to my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be mine own treasure. He cites to the verse above. And God says further, and you shall be unto me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. So they are now holy, the Jewish people, in that they are worthy that there be amongst them a sanctuary through which he makes his divine glory dwell among them. Therefore, his first command concerning the tabernacle, so that he have amongst them a house dedicated to his name, from where he would speak with Moses and command the children of Israel. Thus, the main purpose of the tabernacle was to contain a place in which the divine glory rests. Where's that main place? This is the ark. Just as it says, and there I will meet with you, and I will speak with you from above the ark cover. So to make it clear, what the Ramban is saying, and there's more about this, and I cite to another text at the end of his commentary at the end of the beginning of Parshas Vayakel, and then at the end of Parshas Pekudei again, but they all come to the same point, which is that in Ramban's view, the temple is a place in which God's presence resides. That's what we're supposed to build. We became God's people at Sinai, and now that we became God's people, it's appropriate that we have a place where God and man can meet. So God says, build for me a sanctuary, and I'm going to be there. Specifically, where is that? In the ark. Okay. Now, here's the interesting part, connecting it back to Ramban's view before. If the mitzvah of the temple is to build a home in which God's presence resides, and God's presence primarily resides on the ark, then that's all you would need to fulfill that mitzvah. You don't have to have a menorah. You don't have to have an altar. Right? Because the altar and the menorah are our service of God. And that's what the Ramban says. The mitzvah to build the menorah is not part of the mitzvah of the temple. It's just an extension of the mitzvah to light the menorah. We have to light the menorah because that's the way we serve God. Okay, so build a menorah. We have to bring offerings because that's the way we serve God. So build an altar. But the building itself is much bigger than just a place where we go to serve God. It's a home for God. And God doesn't need the menorah or anything else to have it as a home. The primary object is the ark, which is why the Ramban says building the temple and building the ark are standalone mitzvahs. Even if nothing else were in the temple, that alone, that building, which God designates the place that he's going to meet the Jewish people and speak to Moses, and that's where he's going to have his dwelling amongst us, then that's the fulfillment of that commandment. Further, here the Ramban explicitly is more elaborate in this discussion, where he talks about this idea that there is physical places which serve as a portal to spiritual realm. So he describes that when, I don't have the translation, but this is the gist of what he says here. And if you're familiar with Hebrew, you can read it. There he writes that when God made Adam in the Garden of Eden, he gave Adam, as a human being, he gave him intelligence, like other creatures do not. And therefore, he put Adam in the Garden of Eden in this perfect place, this place in which what he calls mitsukam, which is the drip, the flow of divine energy into our world comes through the Garden of Eden. And it's like this portal through which he can see and experience all the spiritual realm. And he says Israel is the same thing, and specifically the temple. It's a portal to the spiritual divine realm. And this is a place in which you can not just perceive godliness, but actually in which godliness enters into our world through the temple. Right? All to say that in Ramban's view, the primary object of building this temple is to build a place where God can reside. God can manifest his presence, God can reside. And therefore, the primary object is just to build that building, unrelated to whether or not you have other things where you can serve God. That's already step two. Step two is you got to serve God. Okay, so you have to serve God with offering, build an altar. You have to serve God with a menorah, build a menorah. But the primary object of the building itself is expressed in the ark. That's the Holy of Holies, because that becomes the portal through which the divine can manifest in this world. This is Ramban's view. However, Rambam says otherwise. This is Rambam in his book of laws, in the laws of the building of the temple. So he opens up by defining the mitzvah. And he says, it is a positive commandment to construct a house for God, prepared for sacrifices to be offered within. We must celebrate there 3 times a year. As state, you shall make me a sanctuary. The sanctuary constructed by Moshe is already described in the Torah. It was only temporary. As states, for at present, you will have not come onto the resting place and the inheritance. And he goes on to describe the evolution of how the temple that Moses built traveled into Israel, where it was situated there, until finally King David built it. And then how the prophet Ezekiel describes the third temple. He goes through that. But the key words here is, what's the commandment? The commandment is to build a house for God, but not a house where God's presence is manifest, but a house where prepared for sacrifices to be offered within. The definition of the mitzvah in Rambam's view is not to build a home for God that God's manifest in it, but rather to build a home that we can serve him. There's a big distinction. Ramban described the temple as a place where God's presence manifests within the Jewish people. And therefore, it can be manifest even if we can't serve him there, even if there's no altar, even if there's no menorah. It doesn't matter. You built a home where God says, I'm going to be there, as long as you have the ark. Whereas Rambam says, no. The point of this building is not a place where God's presence is manifest, because God's everywhere. The point of this building is that we build a place where we can serve him. So if it's a place where we can serve him, then you have to have an altar, a menorah, the table, all the stuff in the temple that help us serve him. If they aren't there, you haven't fulfilled the mitzvah of building an altar, building a temple. And there's the root dispute between Rambam and Ramban. Whether it's like from top down, the building is a place for God to come into. And if that's the case, it doesn't have to have anything there as long as you build a building. And therefore, it's not part of the commandment of the temple to build an altar or to build a menorah. It's an unrelated mitzvah for you to serve God, Ramban's view. Whereas Rambam, Maimonadies writes, the point of the building is for you to build a space for you to serve God. Okay, so then it's got to be ready to serve him. You have to have an altar, you have to have a menorah, and then for all these elements become part of the mitzvah of building the actual building, because the point of the building is a place where we can serve him. Bottom up versus top down. Hope that was somewhat clear. If it's not, please interrupt me. Now we get to the Rambam's Guide of Perplexed, because we have to contend with this issue that at the end of the day, the verse does say that God dwells in the temple. So how is that missing from the equation in Rambam's description, right? Ramban is very consistent with the verses. The verse describes a home where God's going to dwell. Good. So build a home where God's going to dwell. Issue number 2 is we got to serve him. Okay, so build all the stuff you need to serve him. Build a menorah, build an altar, and so on. 2 separate issues. Whereas Rambam says the very building of the temple itself is not a place for God. It's a place for us to serve him. Okay, so what happened to all those verses describing God as dwelling in the temple? So explains the Rambam in his Guide to the Perplexed as follows. The Guide to the Perplexed is 3 parts. In part 1, the Rambam kind of gives terms and definitions. And it's a very, very beautiful exercise in learning how to think of words in their abstract meaning. So he goes through a number of different words and tells you what they mean in their literal sense, and then teaches you how to extrapolate from their literal sense their more abstract meaning. And he does the same thing with the word dwell. So let's read it. The Hebrew word shachen, as is well known, signifies to dwell, as the verse says, and he was dwelling, shachen, in the plains of Mamre. Or another verse, and it came to pass when Israel dwelt, bishachen, when they dwelt. This is the most common meaning of the word, just that they live somewhere. But dwelling in a place consists, what really is happening when we say that someone dwells somewhere? It's not just that they're physically located somewhere, but it's more than that. Dwelling in a place consists in the continued stay in a place, whether it's a general space, I live in Canada, or a specific place, I live on David Lewis, right? When a living being, a human being, or even an animal, dwells long in a certain place, we say that it stays in that place, although it unquestionably moves about in it, right? So when you say, I live on David Lewis, right? Even if I am visiting Australia, I still live in David Lewis. So what he's telling us is that the word dwell doesn't mean something's actually there. It means that it's consistently to be found there, but not because it necessarily is stuck there all the time, right? So he's already helping us to think of it more abstract. Even though the literal meaning of dwell means you're actually there, he says, well, think of it more broadly. Even if you aren't there, even if you're somewhere else, you're out of town, you still dwell at that specific location because that's where you are consistently. So then he says, okay, now let's extrapolate that even higher and more abstract. The term was next applied metaphorically to inanimate objects, meaning not just to human beings, but to a thing, i.e., to everything which has settled and remained fixed on one object, although the object on which the thing remains is not a place and the thing is not a living thing. For example, let a cloud dwell upon it the day. So the cloud is not a human. There's no doubt that the cloud is not a living being. It's an object. And the day is not a space, a corporeal space, but a division of time. So we can say that the cloud dwelled on this day, even though the day isn't the location, and even though the cloud isn't a human. So what do we mean? We mean the cloud was present throughout that day. Again, because we're talking about a consistency of something in something else, even though we're not talking about people in a place. Because the literal meaning is a person in a place. But he's slowly helping us go more and more abstract. Even if I'm not in that place, I can still say I dwell there. And even if we're not talking about people and we're not talking about an actual geographic space, we can still say something dwells inside of something else. The cloud dwelt on the day, even though the day is time and the cloud is an object. Because we mean one thing is consistent in something else. Okay. Now, he doesn't do this yet, but you can do the same thing with ideas, right? You can say that arithmetic dwells in math, right? They're not objects. They're not living people. They're not even objects. You can't touch them, right? But the notion is still the same, that one thing is consistent within something else. Now he says the same thing is true of what we mean when we say that God dwells. In this sense, he says, the term is employed in reference to God, that is to say, to denote the continuance of his divine presence, Shekhinah, or his providence in some place where the divine presence manifests itself constantly, or in some object which was constantly protected by providence. Compare to the verse, and the glory of the Lord abode, and I will dwell amongst the children of Israel, and for the goodwill of him that dwelt in the bush. But not because God is actually there. The point is that God's interacting with that place. The point is that this is a place where God's providence is continuously seen, but not because he's more there than anywhere else. So whenever the term is applied to the Almighty, it must be taken consistently within the context, in the sense either as referring to the presence of his Shekhinah, i.e. the light that was created for the purpose in a certain place, or the continuance of his providence protecting a certain object, but not because God himself is stuck in any place. So we have a very different view of what we mean that God's in a certain place in Ramban's view versus Ramban. In Ramban's view, it means literally, this is a portal in which the divine presence is manifest. In Rambam, it's this kind of abstract language of saying that God consistently is seen here, or God's consistently showing his protection to this people, to the Jewish people, right? Not that God is like somehow stuck with the Jewish people, but God's constantly watching the Jewish people. And that's what we mean when we say he dwells. Because there's a consistency of one thing inside something else, even if that thing isn't trapped in the other thing. At least not in its literal sense. Hope that was somewhat clear, and we'll get better language in a moment. So what we're looking at here now, please interrupt me if there's anything that's not clear at the moment, because I'm going to take this to another level. Okay, we're clear. We're going to go forward then. What we're looking at here is a text from the fourth Rebbe of Chabad, Rabbi Shmuel of Lubavitch, known as the Maharash. I don't have the text available in English, unfortunately, but he discusses this dispute between Rambam and Ramban and explains it the following. So he starts with Rambam and says like this. He uses the following metaphor. It's a great metaphor to make this point. So say, for example, I am writing down an essay. So the essay itself contains very deep ideas, let's just say, right? I'm writing a dissertation on some complex Talmudic issue. So the essay contains a lot of this very nuanced and deep ideas. Now, what's the medium by which that idea is being transported to the essay? Through my hands and a pen. Now, I cannot write using my foot. But what's the relationship between my hand and the idea? Nothing. My hand does not grasp the idea or the essay in any way, shape, or form. And the relationship between my hand and the idea is just as the relationship between my foot and the idea. It just so happens that my hand is equipped to transmit the idea, but not because my hand is in any way connected to ideas. It's not. It just so happens my hand has the skill to move in a certain direction that will convey the message that's in my idea. All to say that this is an example of how something abstract can be transferred through something very physical, and yet that physical item has no hold on the abstract. My hand has no hold on the idea whatsoever, but yet somehow this hand is precisely equipped to transmit the idea, even though it has no relationship to the idea. And my foot also has no connection to the idea, but my foot for some reason cannot write down words. So here's an example, says Rabbi Shmuel, the Maharash, to explain what the Rambam means when he says that something dwells somewhere, but yet has no relationship to it. The idea is not trapped in my hand, but somehow it dwells in my hand because it goes through my hand to be conveyed on the paper. But in no way is the idea trapped in my hand. So likewise with God's presence. God's presence is everywhere. God's presence, you're going to say God's presence is trapped in the temple? No. It just so happens to be that the temple is equipped to be a place through which you can access divine messaging. But not because God is, it's the hand that God uses to write metaphorically. But not that the actual building, these stones or this location somehow has the ability to contain godliness in it. It can't. Just like my hand cannot contain ideas, and yet my hand is the means through which I will convey ideas when I write them down. So it's a fantastic metaphor that gives us to this idea. Hope that was clear. Please, if it's not clear, please interrupt me. Because I'm now going to go to how he explains the Ramban.
That was brilliant.
It is, right? When I read it the first time, I was blown away. So now, how do we understand Ramban then? How do we understand Ramban where divine presence is manifest in the actual temple? So he explains like this. We have to therefore consider that Ramban's description of divine manifest within creation is the same way in which an idea is manifest in my brain. My brain is also physical, just like my hand. The gray matter in my brain is also physical. It can be, God forbid, in theory, it can be cut up, put in a lab and observed. It's physical. You can touch it, you can weigh it, just like my hand. And yet somehow my brain actually contains the idea. Not like my hand, in which the idea just happens to be conveyed through, but my hand does not in any way understand the idea. My brain does. My brain actually contains the idea. So here we have a physical item that can contain within it the abstract, even though the idea remains transcendent from space. Let's just say the idea of 1 + 1 = 2. 1 + 1 = 2 is everywhere in the world. It's not as if 1 + 1 = 2 only exists in my brain. It exists everywhere. Even if no one is thinking about 1 + 1 = 2, 1 + 1 = 2 still exists everywhere, all the time, at all, in any language, in any country, anywhere. And yet, my brain can actually contain the idea of 1 + 1 = 2. Not just like my hand, which writes it down and it passes through my hand. Right? So there's two ways that we can interact with that which is everywhere. One way is like a hand writing down an idea, where the hand just happens to be a medium through which to convey the idea, but the hand has no hold or relationship with the idea. Or like a brain. A brain is also physical. The idea is also abstract, and yet the physical brain has the capacity to contain an abstract idea. And the same thing is true of the temple. Even though it's true God's everywhere, yet there is a place in which godliness can be contained. God he chooses to manifest himself in a physical place, notwithstanding the fact that he remains everywhere. Just like an idea exists everywhere, and yet it's actually in my brain, even though it exists everywhere and is not subject to space. So there's a paradox, whereas God's beyond space, everywhere, and at the same time is actually manifest within the actual temple. So you could think of it like this. There's two ways in which you can say that God transcends time. Right? One is God transcends time. Time comes, goes, doesn't make a difference. Same thing with space. God's everywhere. He transcends space. But then deeper, it's not as if God is beyond time and therefore time goes along as if like no relationship to him. Like my hand writing words with no relationship to the idea. Ramban says, no. It's true God's beyond time, but he's also in time, in every minute. And in the temple specifically, you'll see him even more because he's actually in there, because this physical space is like the brain that can contain an idea. So it's not just that God is transcendent from our universe and therefore unrelated to it, really. That's how the Rambam would define it almost. God's transcendent, unrelated to what happens in the world. You got to build a temple for you to go talk to him. And because you talk to him continuously, therefore we're going to call it his home, because there's a consistent interaction. But it's not as if God has more attachment to the temple than he is anywhere else, because he's transcendent. That's a Rambam. Whereas Ramban says that's true, God's everywhere, and God does transcend, but he's also within everything. And within the space of the temple, that is a place where God's presence is manifest, just like my ideas are manifest in my physical brain, even though they exist everywhere. Another brilliant metaphor to describe this as well. So here we have two ways of understanding the temple. And the Rebbe comments that these two, although they seem at odds, they don't necessarily contradict. We could think of them as two elements of the temple. There's the top down and there's the bottom up. From our perspective, which is really what Rambam, Maimonadies' job is. Maimonadies wrote a book of laws. Now, when you describe a book of laws, you have to describe what human ability is and what human obligation is. So from that perspective, what's our obligation? To make a place where we can serve God. But Ramban, Nachmanadies, is not limited, as it were, to describing just law. He's describing divinity. And from God's perspective, he can say, yes, in that place where you're going to build to serve him, he himself is going to be manifest in there. So the Rebbe kind of merges these two and says one is from the bottom up. We build a place for God, for us to serve God. And then in that space, God is actually manifest, which is Ramban Nachmanadies' description. And with this, the Rebbe concludes, and I'll conclude with this, a message that the Rebbe says for us. Our prayers are instead of the offerings in the temple. So if in the temple, as they serve God, they made that place like Rambam describes to serve God. And then in response to that, as Ramban describes, the divine presence is manifest in that place. And the same thing happens in our prayer. In our prayer, when we approach prayer, we are making a space in time and in our hearts and minds to serve God. And then in that space and time, in our hearts and mind, God's godliness is manifest. We think of prayer in that way, we have a whole different appreciation coming towards our prayer. Moreover, says the Rebbe, the temple in which divine presence was manifest was not just selfish and that it was manifest here, but because of divine manifestation in the temple, therefore God was interacting with all of the universe. Which means, therefore, in the space of our prayer, in our mind and heart and time, when God's manifest in there because we are serving him, that is also the portal through which God interacts with all of creation. And therefore, the responsibility we have towards prayer and the power, the awesomeness of our prayer is not just a question of my individual relationship with God, which itself is powerful enough that God's manifest in my space and time, in my heart and mind, but it's also responsible for God's interaction with all of the universe. In the same way, the temple was the portal through which the divine manifest interacted with all of creation. So hope this gives us an appreciation for what the temple is, and then an appreciation for our own personal temple, our time of prayer. Thank you for your time. Thank you for listening. If you have any questions, feel free to ask or comment.
Thank you. It was very good. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi. It was wonderful.
Very, very, very beautiful.
You're very welcome. Have a wonderful day, everybody.
Thank you. Same to you.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Very nice. Thank you.
You have a good day.
Thank you. Thank you, Rabbi.